What's up everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. Former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. After months of strikes, blockades, and broken ceasefires over the Strait of Hormuz, something genuinely different just happened. Iran is back at the table with Oman. Real progress is being reported on reopening the strait, and the US is signaling actual optimism about a deal for the first time in a long time. Let's break down how we got here, why this moment feels different from the previous false starts, and whether it's actually going to hold. I'll walk through the timeline of broken promises that got us to this point, then what's actually different about this latest round of talks, then the human and economic cost that's made this drag on so long, then Centcom's own insistence throughout that Iran never actually controlled the strait, and finish with my take on whether this is the real thing or another pause before the next collapse. I want to walk through the timeline here because it explains exactly why Iran signals progress isn't something to take at face value anymore. This war started February 28th with the US-Israeli strikes that killed Khamenei. Iran closed the strait in response. On April 7th, Trump warned, "A whole civilization will die tonight if Iran didn't reopen it." Hours later, a 2-week ceasefire got announced. On April 21st, the day before that ceasefire was set to expire, Trump said he expected to be bombing. If negotiators couldn't reach a deal, then extended it anyway. On May 17th, he warned the clock is ticking and threatened there won't be anything left of Iran. The next day, he held off entirely, citing a request from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Then in June, the actual Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding got signed, and the strait genuinely did reopen for a stretch. That held until it didn't. Iran closed it again in July. The US resumed its naval blockade, and I've covered basically every twist since in my last several videos. The missile attacks on Jordan, the strikes on Kuwait, the Amazon data center claims, all of it stemming from the same underlying fight over who controls this one waterway. According to CNN's most recent reporting, talks between Oman and Iran on reopening the strait and their respective territorial waters have made real progress, according to 2 regional sources. Iran's own military says it halted retaliatory attacks against US allies after Washington paused its strikes for 2 consecutive nights, following 13 straight nights of strikes. That's a genuine mutual de-escalation signal, not just one side declaring victory unilaterally the way previous pauses in this war have sometimes played out. I want to be honest about the caveats, though. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy reportedly stopped 6 vessels this week that tried transiting through routes not approved by Iranian authorities, using warning shots to turn them back. That tells you Iran is still actively asserting control over specific shipping lanes, even while its diplomats are supposedly making progress in Muscat. That's the exact same tension I've flagged throughout this entire war. Iran's negotiators and Iran's IRGC don't always appear to be operating from the same playbook in real time. The economic toll here has been staggering. Just 22 ships crossed the strait on July 9th, compared to 147 crossings the day before this war even began, according to shipping tracker Capeller. Americans are currently paying $4, $11 per gallon of gas nationwide, up from $3.16 a year ago. Oil prices had spiked past $100 a barrel at the worst points of this crisis before settling into the 70s after the June memorandum, and I've tracked that volatility across several of my videos on this war's economic dimension. U.S. intelligence reports from back in April actually warned Iran was unlikely to reopen the strait quickly, precisely because its grip on that waterway is the only real leverage it has over Washington. A finding that's proven remarkably durable given everything that's happened since. Something worth noting, Centcom has repeatedly and consistently pushed back on the idea that Iran ever actually controlled this waterway in any formal sense, regardless of how much disruption Iran's actions caused to actual shipping traffic. Back in early March, Centcom stated flatly that Iran wasn't conducting patrols, and there was no observable mine-laying activity. More recently, Centcom posted directly that Iran does not control the strait. Traffic is flowing, insisting its forces remain positioned specifically to guarantee freedom of navigation, regardless of Iranian rhetoric. That's a consistent messaging position held across 5 months of war, even during periods like the 22 ships in a day collapse in July, when the practical reality on the water looked a lot more like Iranian control than Centcom's statements suggested. I want to explain why Oman specifically keeps showing up as the venue for these talks, because it's not an accident, and understanding it helps explain why this channel of negotiation has proven more durable than some of the other diplomatic threads I've covered throughout this war. Oman has spent decades cultivating a genuinely unusual position in the region, close enough to both the US and Iran to be trusted by each, while staying deliberately outside the tighter Gulf Cooperation Council alignment that puts Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait more squarely on Washington's side of most regional disputes. That balancing act has made Muscat the default venue for exactly this kind of sensitive, high-stakes back-channel diplomacy going back years, well before this current war even started. That history matters because it tells you this isn't some improvised last-minute mediation effort. It's Iran and the US falling back on the one channel both governments have consistently trusted enough to keep using, even after every other diplomatic framework in this war, the original ceasefire, the Islamabad Memorandum, repeated deadline extensions, has eventually broken down. I've covered in earlier videos how Qatar and Jordan both absorbed direct strikes at various points in this conflict, which realistically complicates their ability to serve as fully neutral mediators going forward. Oman, by contrast, has largely stayed outside the direct strike zone throughout this entire war, which likely explains why it's the venue producing what CNN's sources are describing as genuine progress right now, rather than Doha or Oman, both of which I've covered getting pulled directly into the crossfire in my earlier videos on this conflict. I also want to unpack a specific phrase from that CNN reporting, progress on reopening the strait and their respective territorial waterways, because I don't think a single sentence does justice to how technically complicated that actually is to negotiate. The Strait of Hormuz isn't simply open water, it's bordered on one side by Iranian territorial waters, and on the other by Omani territorial waters. And the internationally recognized shipping lanes through that strait have historically depended on both countries allowing transit through their respective territorial claims under long-standing maritime law principles, specifically the right of transit passage, recognized under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Iran's closures throughout this war have functioned, at least in part, by asserting the right to restrict passage through its own territorial waters, specifically, forcing vessels either to use only Iranian-approved routes, or, more recently, simply turning back ships attempting alternate paths. Exactly the incident I mentioned earlier involving 6 vessels stopped this week. Any durable resolution has to actually resolve that specific legal and territorial question, not just achieve a temporary, informal understanding that ships can pass through for now. That's exactly why progress in these talks likely involves detailed technical negotiation over exactly which routes get formally recognized, what happens in Iranian versus Omani waters specifically, and what enforcement or verification mechanism, if any, gets attached to guarantee compliance going forward. That's a much harder, slower diplomatic project than simply agreeing in principle that ships should be allowed through, and it's exactly the kind of technical complexity that's made previous attempts at resolving this specific dispute collapse repeatedly throughout this war. I think it's also worth revisiting something I've covered in earlier videos on this war, the internal political pressure each government is managing that shapes how much room their negotiators actually have to compromise. I did an entire video on Iran's own domestic economic crisis, the currency collapse, the bizarre protests, the broader legitimacy pressure the regime has been managing throughout this entire conflict, completely separate from the external war itself. A government under that kind of internal strain has real incentive to actually resolve the external conflict. Since continued war spending and continued disruption to oil exports, Iran's primary source of foreign currency, directly worsens the domestic economic collapse I documented in that video. On the American side, that CBS News poll I found in my research is worth mentioning specifically. It found most respondents describing this conflict as more difficult than Trump had expected going in. That's a meaningful domestic political data point too. A war that's dragged on this long, produced this many false diplomatic breakthroughs, and cost the kind of money Hegseth disclosed to Congress in the figure I covered in an earlier video, generates its own kind of domestic pressure toward an actual resolution, separate from whatever the underlying strategic calculus around Iran's nuclear program or missile capability might suggest. Both of these pressures, Iran's economic collapse and America's own war weariness, point in the same general direction, toward wanting this specific dispute over the strait actually resolved rather than continuing to cycle through temporary pauses and collapses. Whether that shared incentive is enough to actually produce a durable agreement this time is a different question entirely. But it does help explain why both sides may be more genuinely motivated toward Muscat producing real results right now than they've been at various earlier points in this war. I want to spend some more time on the economic picture, because the 22 ships versus 147 ships comparison I mentioned earlier deserves more context about how the broader shipping industry has actually adapted to 5 months of this kind of disruption. I've covered in earlier videos how some shipping companies started shifting toward the Cape of Good Hope route around Africa, or in some cases reconsidering the Red Sea route despite the ongoing Houthi threat there, specifically to avoid the risk and cost premium associated with transiting Hormuz during this war. Those adaptations don't reverse instantly, just because talks in Muscat are reportedly making progress. Shipping companies that have spent months restructuring their routes, insurance arrangements, and delivery schedules around avoiding this specific waterway aren't going to snap back to normal operations overnight based on reported diplomatic progress alone. They're going to want to see sustained, verified, reliable transit before committing vessels and cargo back to the shorter but riskier route through the strait. That adaptation lag is actually one of the most underappreciated aspects of a crisis like this one. Even in the best case scenario, where this round of talks produces a genuine, lasting agreement and the strait reopens fully and stays open, the actual shipping volume through that corridor likely won't snap back to the pre-war 147 ships a day baseline immediately. It'll take real time for insurers to reassess risk premiums, for shipping companies to rebuild confidence in the route's reliability, and for the broader logistics networks that had adapted around this disruption to shift back. That's worth keeping in mind as a reality check against any premature declarations of full economic normalization the moment a diplomatic breakthrough gets announced. The practical ground-level recovery from a crisis like this one tends to lag well behind the political headlines describing its resolution. I want to be rigorous about this because I've now covered several previous moments in this war that were also described as genuine progress before ultimately collapsing. The original April ceasefire was explicitly tied to Iran reopening the strait and initially appeared to be holding. The June memorandum, formally signed with actual diplomatic ceremony, represented an even more concrete commitment, and the strait did genuinely reopen for a real, sustained period following that agreement, only to collapse again in July after the tanker attacks I've covered extensively in my other videos. So what, if anything, makes this specific round of Oman-mediated talks different from those two previous instances that both eventually failed? I think the honest answer is, not much yet, at least not in terms of formal commitments. What is different is the sequencing. This round of progress is happening alongside an actual verified 2-night pause in strikes and a corresponding halt in Iranian retaliatory attacks, a real, observable, mutual de-escalation in actual military activity, rather than purely diplomatic language layered on top of continued fighting the way some earlier progress announcements were. That's a meaningfully different starting point than either the April ceasefire, which came together very suddenly after Trump's "civilization will die tonight" threat, or the June memorandum, which, despite the formal signing ceremony, didn't prevent renewed tanker attacks and strait closure just weeks later. Whether this more gradual, mutually verified de-escalation proves more durable than those two more abrupt previous attempts remains to be seen, but I think it's a genuinely different pattern worth tracking specifically for that reason. I want to close out this expanded section with a genuinely practical question: what would it actually take for this specific dispute to get resolved in a way that doesn't just collapse again in a few weeks the way every previous attempt has? Based on everything I've covered across this entire series, I think a durable resolution requires at least 3 things happening together, rather than any single one in isolation. First, an actual, technically detailed agreement on territorial waters and shipping routes, the kind of granular legal resolution I described earlier, rather than a vague, high-level commitment to keep the strait open that leaves room for exactly the kind of unilateral IRGC route enforcement we're still seeing, even during this reported progress. 6 ships turned back just this week, despite the talks. Second, some kind of verification or enforcement mechanism that doesn't depend purely on trust, given how many times throughout this war I've documented a gap between what Iran's diplomats commit to and what Iran's military forces actually do on the water in practice. And third, enough sustained economic and political incentive on both sides, Iran's domestic economic crisis, America's own war weariness, to make both governments genuinely prefer a lasting resolution over the alternative of continuing this cycle of strikes, pauses, and collapses indefinitely. Whether Muscat's current round of talks actually produces all 3 of those elements together, rather than just another round of positive rhetoric followed by another collapse, is genuinely the question that matters most right now, and it's exactly what I'll be watching for as this specific story develops over the coming days and weeks. I want to bring in something I found in my research that I think deserves real attention because it's aged remarkably well given everything that's happened since. Back in March, former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis warned publicly at a conference in Houston that the U.S. would effectively cede control of the strait if it declared victory over Iran prematurely. His exact concern was that Iran would then claim ownership of the strait and effectively impose a tax on every ship passing through. And he was blunt about how difficult the underlying strategic position actually was, saying flatly, "I can't identify a lot of options." That warning is worth revisiting now, specifically because of what it implies about this current round of talks. If Mattis's concern was accurate, and I think the last 5 months of this war have largely validated it, then any resolution to this crisis needs to actually resolve who has practical control over that waterway, not just achieve a temporary reopening that leaves the underlying question of control unanswered. A scenario where ships resume transiting the strait, but only because Iran has tacitly agreed to allow it, rather than because any formal, durable framework has actually been established, would leave the exact vulnerability Mattis warned about fully intact. Iran retaining the practical ability to reassert control and closure at any future moment it chooses, essentially holding global energy markets hostage on an ongoing basis, rather than through occasional dramatic escalations like the ones I've covered throughout this war. That's exactly why I think the technical territorial waters negotiation I described earlier matters so much. A resolution that doesn't address the underlying control question directly is really just setting up the next version of this exact crisis somewhere down the road. I want to spend more time on Centcom's consistent "Iran does not control the Strait" messaging, because I think there's a real deliberate strategic communications logic behind maintaining that position so consistently throughout this entire war, even during periods when the practical, on-the-ground reality looked quite different. Publicly conceding that an adversary controls a piece of critical global infrastructure, even temporarily, carries real costs beyond the immediate embarrassment. It could embolden Iran's own negotiating position, giving them leverage to extract greater concessions, specifically because their control has been formally acknowledged rather than just practically observed. It could also unsettle allies and energy markets in ways that go beyond what the actual physical disruption already causes, since formal acknowledgement of an adversary's control over critical infrastructure tends to generate a different, more severe kind of market and diplomatic reaction than treating the same disruption as a temporary, illegitimate interference that will inevitably get resolved. That's likely why you've seen Centcom maintain this consistent messaging framework across the entire arc of this war, from the March statement dismissing Iran's closure threats as unable to survive contact with reality, through the more recent statements insisting traffic is flowing and Iran doesn't control the waterway, even amid a documented collapse from 147 ships a day to just 22. I think it's worth reading that consistent messaging as exactly what it is: a deliberate, strategic communications choice rather than a literal, moment-by-moment factual description of shipping conditions on the water. Understanding that distinction helps make sense of why Centcom's statements and the actual shipping data I cited earlier in this video can simultaneously both be true in their own respective ways. Centcom accurately describing its own force's capability and intent to keep the strait open, while shipping companies simultaneously and accurately describing a massive practical collapse in actual transit volume driven by risk aversion, regardless of what Centcom's official position technically claims about who controls the waterway. I also want to connect this specific update back to the broader arc of everything I've covered across this entire series on this war. This strait dispute isn't really a standalone issue. It's the central recurring flashpoint that's driven nearly every other major escalation I've documented. The tanker attacks that triggered the Jordan and Kuwait exchanges, the bridge and infrastructure campaign aimed at degrading Iran's coastal logistics, the Amazon data center strikes tied to Iran's broader retaliatory posture. Even the Pickaxe Mountain nuclear targeting threats exist in the shadow of this same underlying conflict over who ultimately controls this waterway, and the broader terms of any lasting settlement between these two governments. That's exactly why I think this specific piece of diplomatic news, real progress reported in Muscat, a 2-night mutual pause holding for now, deserves more attention than it might initially seem to warrant on its own. If this round of talks actually produces the kind of durable, technically detailed resolution I described earlier, one that addresses territorial waters, includes real verification mechanisms, and holds up against the same kind of domestic pressures on both sides that have derailed every previous attempt, that wouldn't just resolve the Strait crisis specifically, it would likely remove the central flashpoint that's been driving the broader trajectory of this entire war for months. That's a genuinely significant possibility, and it's exactly why I wanted to dedicate a full video to walking through not just what's being reported, but why this specific pattern of negotiation might actually be different from the false starts that have defined so much of this conflict's diplomatic history up to this point. I think this latest round of talks deserves cautious optimism rather than either dismissal or celebration. The fact that Iran halted retaliatory attacks in direct response to the US pausing strikes, rather than continuing to escalate regardless, is a genuinely positive signal after months of exactly the opposite pattern. But I've watched this exact cycle, real progress reported, only for it to collapse within days or weeks, play out repeatedly throughout this entire war, until vessels are actually transiting that strait at something close to normal volume, and staying there for a sustained period rather than just a 2-night pause. I don't think this deserves to be called resolved. What the US military has genuinely been waiting for isn't a diplomatic headline. It's the strait actually reopening and staying open, and we're not there yet. I also want to be honest about what would actually change my assessment here. If, over the coming week, we see shipping volume through the strait begin climbing back meaningfully above that 22 ships a day low, if the IRGC stops turning back vessels on unapproved routes the way it did just this week, even amid the reported progress, and if this pause in strikes extends well past the 2 nights currently on record toward something closer to the sustained calm the June memorandum initially provided before its collapse, that combination would represent genuine, verifiable evidence that this round of talks is producing something durable rather than another temporary lull. Short of that combination actually materializing, I think the responsible position is exactly the one I've taken throughout this video. Real, meaningful progress worth reporting on, but not yet the kind of resolution that would justify calling this crisis over, given how many times this exact pattern has played out and then unraveled across the 5 months I've spent covering this war. So that's where this stands. Real progress in Muscat. A 2-night pause holding for now, but Iranian naval forces still actively turning back ships using unapproved routes, even as negotiators talk. This is the closest thing to good news I've had to report on this war in a while, and I genuinely hope it holds. Given everything I've laid out in this video, the deep history of false starts, the technical complexity of actually resolving the territorial waters question, the domestic pressures pushing both governments toward wanting this resolved, and Mattis's still relevant warning about what happens if this gets declared over prematurely, I think the next week or two is going to tell us a lot about whether this is genuinely different or just the latest chapter in a 5-month cycle of hope and collapse. I'll keep tracking this closely. And if this pause holds and shipping volume actually starts recovering, that'll be one of the most significant developments in this entire war, worth its own dedicated follow-up video the moment there's enough real data to confirm it's actually happening. And if it collapses the way the April ceasefire and June memorandum both eventually did, I'll be back here covering that too. Because at this point, I think all of us following this conflict have learned the same lesson. Don't declare this crisis over until the ships are actually moving and staying moving. What do you guys think? Does this round of talks feel genuinely different, or are we just watching the same cycle play out one more time? Let me know in the comments below. I read everyone. If tracking every twist and turn of this war is what you come to this channel for, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps me keep bringing you these updates as fast as this story keeps developing. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.